We think of soap and candles as things you buy. Two different products, two different aisles, two different stores. For most of human history, they were the same thing, made on the same day, from the same animal, in the same iron pot out behind the house. One cow could keep a family in light and clean linen for the better part of a year. The trick was a chain of steps so precise that one wrong move could spoil the entire batch. And the pioneers had it down to a ritual. Late autumn, somewhere on the American frontier. The first hard frost has already settled over the fields, and the days are getting shorter by the minute. Inside a small log cabin, the sun is gone by 5 in the evening, and the only thing standing between a family and total darkness is whatever they can burn. There's no general store around the corner, and even if there were, store-bought candles cost more than most homesteaders could spare. So every single thing that family needed to see at night and to stay clean through the long winter, they had to make with their own hands. And it all started with the one event that defined the season, the autumn slaughter. When the cold weather finally arrived, it was safe to butcher the larger animals without the meat spoiling in the heat. A cow that had spent all summer grazing in the pasture would be slaughtered, and almost nothing on that animal went to waste. The meat was salted and smoked for the months ahead, the hide went to leather, and the bones became tools and buttons. But the part that mattered most for surviving the dark season was the fat. Not all fat was created equal, and this is the detail almost everyone misses. The fat the pioneers wanted was the hard, crumbly fat packed around the animal's kidneys and loins known as suet. This was the prize, because it rendered down into the cleanest, firmest, longest-lasting product of them all. Softer fat from other parts of the body worked too, but it produced a greasier, smellier result that didn't hold up nearly as well. A single cow could give a family somewhere in the range of 20 to 40 pounds of usable fat, depending on its size and how well it had been fed that summer. Sheep fat was actually considered the finest of all for what came next, and the fat from a pig was the least desirable because of its strong smell. But for most families on the frontier, the beef from one good animal was the foundation everything else was built on. That raw fat couldn't be used as it was, though. In its natural state, it would rot, turn rancid, and stink up the whole cabin within days. It had to be transformed first, and that transformation has a name. The process is called rendering, and at its heart, it is beautifully simple. The fat gets chopped into small pieces, the smaller the better, and then it goes into a large cast iron kettle set over a low, steady fire. Slow and patient is the entire game here. If the fire gets too hot, the fat scorches, and the whole batch takes on a burnt taste and smell that ruins it for candles and soap alike. As the kettle warms, the fat slowly melts into a golden liquid, and all the bits of meat, tissue, and impurity that were trapped inside begin to separate out. Those leftover pieces brown and shrink and eventually sink to the bottom, and the pioneers had a name for them too, calling them cracklings. Nothing was thrown away on the frontier, so those crispy browned bits were often eaten or fed to the animals. Once the fat was fully melted, it was poured through a cloth or a fine sieve to strain out every last impurity, and the cleaner you got it, the better your candles and soap would turn out. Many families strained it 2 or 3 times to be sure. What was left was pure, clean tallow, and as it cooled in a bowl, it hardened into a firm, waxy, almost snow-white block that could be stored for months without spoiling. Think about that for a second. They had just turned something that would have rotted in a single day into a stable material that would last all winter. Pay attention to what happened next, because that one block of tallow was about to become 2 completely different things. The first job that tallow had to do was push back the darkness, and that meant candles. But before any tallow touched a wick, the wick itself had to be made. Pioneers usually twisted together loose strands of cotton, and sometimes they used linen or even the dried inner pith of certain reeds when cotton was scarce. One thing worth knowing is that the neat, self-trimming braided wick we take for granted today was not invented until well into the 1800s. For that, every wick had to be trimmed by hand as it burned, or the flame would smoke, sputter, and gutter out. With the wicks ready, there were two ways to turn tallow into candles. The older and more common method was dipping. A row of wicks was tied to a stick, and that whole stick was lowered down into the melted tallow, then lifted out and left to cool. Each dip added one thin layer of fat to the wick, so the candle grew a little thicker every time. A patient candle maker would dip the same batch dozens of times back and forth, layer after layer, often hanging the rods between two chairs to cool in between. It could take an entire afternoon to build a single set of candles up to a usable thickness. The second method used candle molds, usually made of tin, with several tubes set into a wooden frame. A wick was threaded down the center of each tube. The melted tallow was poured in around it, and once everything cooled and set, the finished candles slid right out. Molded candles looked cleaner and more uniform, while dipped candles actually gave off slightly better light. Now, these tallow candles were nobody's idea of luxury. They burned with a smoky flame, they gave off a heavy animal smell, and the light they cast was dim and flickering next to the bright, sweet, burning beeswax candles that wealthier families could afford. But most people never had that choice. Tallow was what they had, and tallow is what lit their nights. And for families who couldn't spare much tallow at all, or even the cotton for a proper wick, there is an even simpler kind of light called the rush light. They would gather common rushes from a damp meadow, peel away most of the outer skin, and leave a thin strip behind to support the soft inner pith. That pith was then soaked in whatever grease or leftover fat they had on hand, and once it dried, it could be lit at one end. A rushlight had no real wick of its own, so it burned fast and had to be propped at an angle in a simple metal holder, throwing off just enough of a glow to cross a dark room by. It was the cheapest light a household could make, and for the poorest families on the frontier, it was often the only one they had. However it was made, that light was rationed with real care. A single candle might be the only thing burning in the whole cabin on a long winter evening, so the family would gather in, close to share its small circle of glow, mending clothes, reading scripture, or simply talking before bed. When the work was finished, the flame was pinched out with a metal snuffer rather than left to burn down, because every minute of tallow was a minute that would have to be earned back at the next autumn slaughter. Light was precious in a way that's almost impossible to imagine today. That same block of fat, though, had a second life waiting for it, and this is where the system goes from impressive to genuinely ingenious. Light was only half of what came out of that one animal. The other half solved a problem every bit as serious as darkness, and it was hiding in plain sight in the cold gray ashes of the very fire the family was standing next to. On the frontier, staying clean was a matter of survival. Dirty clothes and dirty bodies bred disease, and disease in a place with no doctor for 50 miles could kill you. Families needed soap, and soap takes two ingredients. One of them was the tallow they'd already rendered. The other was something far more dangerous, and they made it from the ashes in their own fireplace. All year long, pioneers saved the ashes from their fires, but only from hardwoods like oak, hickory, and maple, because softwood ashes were too weak to do the job. Those ashes were packed into a wooden barrel or a V-shaped trough called an ash hopper, and then water, ideally soft rainwater, was poured slowly over the top. As the water trickled down through the ashes, it pulled out a harsh chemical and carried it through a small hole at the bottom, dripping out as a dark brown liquid, and that liquid was lye. This next part is something most people never hear about. LYE is no joke. It's strong enough to burn skin and dissolve tissue, and getting the strength right was a matter of skill, not guesswork. The classic test was to float a fresh egg or a potato in the liquid. If it bobbed up with about 1/4 of itself showing above the surface, the lye was just right. If it sank, the lye was too weak and had to be poured through fresh ashes again. If it floated too high, it was too strong, and a little water brought it back down. You'd think a job this dangerous would be left to a specialist. On the frontier, it was usually done by the women of the house, by feel and experience alone. If you're finding this fascinating, take a second to subscribe, because frontier skills like this one are exactly what this channel is built on. Picture that same iron kettle scrubbed clean and set back over the fire. Into it went the clean tallow, melted down once more, and then the lye water was added in slowly and carefully. The whole mixture was brought to a steady boil, and then came the part that took real endurance. The work now was stirring, and it went on for hours. The fat and the lye had to be coaxed into combining, and a tired arm and a long afternoon were simply the price of clean clothes. What was actually happening in that kettle is a chemical reaction called saponification. The fatty acids in the tallow were bonding with the alkali in the LYE, and the two were transforming into something entirely new, giving off heat as they did. Slowly, the watery mixture would thicken, turning from a thin liquid into something closer to a heavy, glossy mush. When it coated the stirring paddle and held its shape, the soap was done. The soap that came out of this process was nothing like the firm bars we buy today. Lye made from wood ashes produces a soft, almost jelly-like soap, and that's exactly what most frontier families ended up with. They'd scoop it out of a crock whenever they needed it. If a family wanted hard bars they could cut and stack, they had to stir in common salt, which forced the soap to firm up enough to be poured into molds, sliced, and left to cure for weeks. Either way, it cleaned just the same, and not great smelling though it was, having any soap at all was a small miracle. Now step back and look at the whole system, because this is where it becomes something close to genius. One animal, slaughtered on a single cold morning, carried a family through the winter. Its fat was rendered into tallow, and that one material split into the two things a household could not survive without. It became light in the form of candles, and it became cleanliness in the form of soap, two completely different products born from the exact same source. And the loop closes even tighter than that. The lye that turned the tallow into soap came from ashes, and those ashes came from the very same hearth fire that the family cooked over, warmed themselves beside, and rendered the fat on in the first place. The fire that cooked their food handed them the secret ingredient for their soap. Almost nothing entered that homestead from the outside, and almost nothing left it as waste. Whether one animal lasted a family an entire year came down to how big the household was and how many candles they burned each night. A large family in a long, dark winter went through their stores faster than a small one. But the rhythm held year after year. Every autumn, the slaughter refilled the supply, the kettle came back out, and the whole quiet, brilliant chain ran all over again. So the next time you walk down a store aisle and reach past the candles on your way to the soap, remember that those two shelves used to be one. The same animal, the same kettle, the same pair of hands on the same cold afternoon. What takes us 2 aisles and a quick swipe of a card once took an entire household, a full season of skill, patience, and work. And every flickering candle and every scoop of soap was proof that a family could make almost everything they needed from almost nothing at all. It's a kind of self-reliance that's nearly vanished today, living on only in the hands of a few who still remember how it was done. For hundreds of years, this was simply how people kept the lights on and the dirt off, season after season, animal after animal. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. If you would like to continue watching more of my videos on frontier skills, you can click the video on the screen now.